right, I see a lot of people joining in. Thank you so much for participating, for registering to our 6th webinar in this series on the German Supply Chain Act and practical tools that we'll share with you throughout the series on specific obligations or due diligence characteristics. Today we will be focusing on a deep dive on preventative and remedial actions under the German Supply Chain Act. So this is the focus of today's webinar, which is of course always co-hosted by also the German PST, Isabel Reichenbach here, who's doing this together with us, and also of course supported by Michaela Streibelt from the German Help Desk for Business and Human Rights. And then we also have two businesses sharing their practices today with us. My name is Francis Wilmer, Senior Advocacy Engagement Advisor at amfori, and I'll run you through the first half of the session today, and then later on Isabel will take over. But maybe I can just quickly run you through a couple of housekeeping rules. It's the same as usual. You will all be muted. If you have a question, you can just post it in the Q&A section on the bottom or in the chat, but preferably Q&A. And then also we will be sharing the recording of this webinar as well as the slides with you after the webinar, together with a brief satisfaction survey. Now let me run you through the agenda for the day. So the next speaker will be Michaela Streibelt from the Help Desk on Business and Human Rights. She will speak about prevention and remediation in the context of the German Supply Chain Act. So what are the requirements of that act when it comes to prevention and remediation? We then have a longer Q&A session where you can ask any questions that you may have when it comes to this topic. And then afterwards, we have very brief presentations on the practical tools supporting preventative and remedial action from amfori side, as well as from the German PST side. That's not a question, it's a statement, contrary to what's written on the agenda. And then we also have some learn from some business perspectives. So we have Regina Kalfels, team lead for sustainability at Deltex, and Juan Jose Gomez, a sustainability supply chain manager at El Corte Inglés, who will be sharing their experiences and approaches on prevention and remediation. And then we have another Q&A, and then we come to a close. So just very briefly, just about amfori, just also for the participants that are not amfori members, since this is a public webinar, so we have more than 300 registrations. So just very briefly on our organization, we're a leading business association for sustainable trade, empowering companies across the globe to operate successful and responsible businesses by helping them improve the environmental, social, and governance performance of their value chains. And we do this through 3 key products. So the environmental due diligence product, amfori BAPI, our social due diligence product, amfori BSCI, and then our governance due diligence tools, so the quality management initiative, ESG risk compass, amfori insights, as well as our Speak for Change supply chain grievance mechanism. And all of these products and efforts are underpinned by capacity building and training, as well as our advocacy and engagement activities. We have 2,500 members, retailers, brands, importers, and so on, that use our platform to map their supply chain and then carry out due diligence in these on ESG matters through our different tools. More than 40,000 producers that are on our sustainability platform in more than 48 countries. Our members are located, and then we have in more than 100 countries so-called sustainability operations. So that includes, for instance, monitorings, social, environmental, and so on. And all our members have access to, and then of course the capacity building activities and so on, as well as local network representatives on the ground that support the dialogue with the business partners in the key sourcing countries of our members, but also of course give local support to our members in the key countries where our members are located. That about amfori. Just briefly, that's a snapshot of our membership. I'm not going to go into detail here. According Glass and Deltex are two of them that will be speaking today, but I'll move on to hand over to Michaela Streibelt now, who will give you a deep dive on preventative and remedial actions under the German Supply Chain Act. Thank you so much, Michaela, for your continuous support and for being with us again today, and handing over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And yes, before I'm going to start with our deep dive into preventive and remedial measures, I want to briefly show the activities of the German Help Desk, the organization I'm working for. So we have 4 main fields of activity. Basically, our main role is to provide free of charge advice to companies. Then we also do training programs. We conduct customized trainings for companies that we tailor to their specific needs, but we also support companies in designing their own training programs, for example, that they want to roll out in relation to their own staff or in relation to their suppliers. And we have an e-learning program that's more very beginner introduction into business and human rights in a company risk management context. If this is interesting to you, I believe that the slides will be shared with you afterwards. You might notice that there's some hyperlinks on the slide, so I invite you to, if this is interesting to you, click on them and check it out. Like all of our services, the e-learning is free of charge as well. And then we participate in events. We have a couple of own formats where we try to get different actors together, like business actors, actors from the political sphere, and civil society actors. But we also have a series of online webinars of our own, and we participate in events like today. We have a couple of free of charge online tools that I believe can be incredibly helpful for companies in different contexts when conducting due diligence in relation to human rights and environmental risks. One of the tools is the SME Compass, consisting of 2 components: the due diligence compass, hands-on guidance for implementing due diligence processes in companies, and the standards compass that helps companies identify how they can use standards and certifications in the context of the due diligence process. Our tool CSR Risk Checker provides for a starting point for the abstract risk analysis, and our tool Business and Human Rights Navigator shows how 10 specific human rights problems from the context of business and human rights can be addressed in the context of the due diligence process, and works a lot with practical examples from companies and how they actually address these different tools. So much about a little introduction on the help desk on business and human rights. So we're talking today about preventive and remedial measures, and I'm first going to show you what the law says exactly on this, and then what boundaries exist and what exactly companies have to do to derive from the criteria effectiveness and appropriateness. So in relation to preventive measures are measures that companies have to do when they identify risks, and risks basically are potential adverse impacts, so a situation in which there's a certain likeliness of the violation of a protected legal position. And you know that the German Supply Chain Act differentiates the supply chain into 3 spheres: own operations, direct suppliers, and indirect suppliers. And what you're seeing here on the slide is the examples, the presumptive examples that the law gives in relation to preventive measures divided up into these 3 spheres. Presumptive examples means that companies don't have to do exactly these measures in order to prevent a risk from materializing into a violation. It doesn't mean that they have to do all of these. It is also possible that one of these measures alone is enough to minimize the risk sufficiently so that there's no more risk, that the risk might result in a violation, or that they have appropriately, and we'll look at the criteria of appropriateness later, appropriately acted enough in relation to what can be expected of them, because we know the Due Diligence Act doesn't require companies to guarantee outside of their own operations that there's no risk and violations. And it might mean that a company doesn't have to minimize a risk down to zero, but minimize it a certain extent. And yes, you can see that there's different approaches taken. Obviously, in relation to direct suppliers, the law really relies on the contractual relationship between the company and their suppliers, because this can be a really helpful tool. But there's some limitations to that we'll look at as well, because contractual assurances alone, and there's a lot of negative practice that we've been seeing for a long time already. Contractual assurances alone sometimes don't really work well in order to address risks. So it's very well possible that companies need to combine different of these tools, different of these presumptive examples, but it's also possible that companies come up with a different measure that is not mentioned in the law as a presumptive example and manage to sufficiently minimize either down to zero or in an appropriate way the risk, and then don't need to engage in any of these further activities. So when we're looking at remedial measures, on the next slide, please. Remedial measures is measures that companies have to take when they have identified a violation. So this is a situation in which one of the protected legal positions is not at risk of being violated, but has been violated already. So a situation in which a company, for example, has discovered that emergency exits are blocked, has discovered that there's no sufficient fire safety training, has discovered that their wages were not paid in an amount sufficient, that work time was too long. And yeah, I've mentioned that outside of the own operations, there's no obligation to guarantee. So there's no obligation to actually result in a full remediation. This is different in the own operations because the company there's a direct addressee of the primary laws that require them to pay wages, provide for operational health and safety, and so on. And so in the own operations, the remedial action must lead to a termination of the violation. And in relation to everyone else, so direct and indirect suppliers, how far they have to go, what they have to do, depends on effectiveness and appropriateness. In some contexts, violations require complex remedial measures. So complex individual measures that are being combined over a longer period of time, for example, restoring environment after toxic substances were released, or making substantial changes to the machinery or to the building in order to create a safe working environment. So in this context, companies have to create a remediation plan with specific timeframes and individual successes that they require after the elapse of time. And what's really important to note is that the Due Diligence Act prioritizes enabling before withdrawal. So that means the Act prioritizes remediation, prevention and remediation actually over terminating business relationships. The termination of a business relationship always only is a last resort, and there's very strict requirements. There's a really high threshold to be met before termination becomes something that companies might have to engage in. So next, I want to look at effectiveness and appropriateness. And I always start with effectiveness because I think it's kind of easier to understand these concepts. So the Due Diligence Act describes obligations of means, obligations of conduct. So something that companies have to do that doesn't really necessarily have to lead to certain results. So no obligation to guarantee outside of the own operations, obviously. And there's limitations to that. So this obligation is being shaped by two criteria, effectiveness and appropriateness. And effectiveness basically means that an action a company engages in order to fulfill a due diligence obligation must be something that is suited for the purpose. So companies are not allowed to engage in an activity that from the start already doesn't promise any progress towards this success, towards ending risks and violations. And then appropriateness basically tells us how far a company has to go towards this goal. So effectiveness tells us which direction they have to go, or which out of several possible paths is allowed to be chosen. And on the next slide, please, appropriateness tells us what companies, how far companies have to go, or maybe there's possible different effective measures that are available, and then maybe the appropriateness reduces the selection of the company even further to what they have to do exactly. When determining these criteria, companies have to do this from an ex ante perspective, so from the moment they're acting, not ex post, from after they have done this action already, and they have a margin of appreciation in this context. So they can, within the framework of these criteria, determine this themselves. And appropriateness is basically a set of criteria that don't stand in a particular hierarchy to one another. You see it on the slide, have to be considered equally, have to be balanced against one another. And if we take recourse to the UNGP and the OECD guidance, it becomes quite clear, as a tool for interpretation, it becomes quite clear that these criteria play a different role for different obligations under the Supply Chain Act. So the nature and extent of a company's activities obviously it says how much can be required of a company to do. Nature and extent means what resources are available, but also how risk-prone are they. A more risk-prone company might be required to invest a larger percentage of the available resources into risk management. So this is a criterion that becomes very important when looking at how much can be expected from a company as an investment into these measures. Preventive and remedial measures might be cost intensive. And then the ability to influence the party directly responsible for the violation is very telling in relation to what type of action might be available to a company. Obviously, depending on the influence a company has, different measures might be possible for them. And then the violation-based criteria, severity, reversibility, and probability of a violation are also very important when determining how much can be required of a company. Obviously, the more severe, the more likely, the less reversible a violation is, the more is expected of a company to remediate it or to also prevent it. And the nature of the causal contribution is really important in relation to appropriateness, but also in relation to effectiveness. In relation to appropriateness, it's very important because it is expected of companies to identify their own contributions to risks and violations and proactively start addressing them. And so this means that companies need to reduce or end own contributions to negative impacts. This criterion is also important in relation to effectiveness because in many cases, measures that don't also address the reasons for risks or violations don't promise effectiveness. So without ending own contributions to negative impacts, it's not very likely that these actions will be effective in addressing these negative impacts. So when I want to take a quick glance in relation to the more complex situation that we're dealing with in supply chains, because the obliged company that wants to engage in a measure outside of their own operations faces having to work together with other actors. And this becomes in particular really important in relation to the deeper supply chain, where the ability to influence the party directly responsible for violation might be very, very limited, and it might be very difficult to work together with them in order to address risks and violations, because maybe these actors are not known to them. And you might know that the Supply Chain Act doesn't really limit obligations to own operations and direct suppliers, but creates the illusion that it emphasizes these two spheres over the deeper supply chain. And obligations in the deeper supply chain only exist when a certain knowledge threshold is reached. It's called substantiated knowledge under the law, and you see it on the slide. It's defined as actual indications that suggest a violation of a human rights or environmental related violation. And what does this mean? You see examples on the right-hand side of the slide. These are taken from the explanatory memorandum of the German government with which they introduced the law into parliament. And from these examples, you can see that the bar the threshold for substantiated knowledge is relatively low. So it's enough that it's a risk industry, that it's a high risk country, for example, incidents in the past. So we have a relatively low threshold for substantiated knowledge. And if we combine this with the criteria of the appropriateness, we see immediately, because the appropriateness tells us to focus our efforts, violation-based criteria, severity, likeliness of occurrence, reversibility of a violation, where problems are most severe and most likely to occur. And we see immediately that, looking at this and thinking there's a focus on own operations and direct supplier is an illusion. And the problem then arises that it's very difficult for companies to address problems in the deeper supply chain. It might be very difficult to identify risks and violations in the deeper supply chain at an individual supplier's level, because there is no direct relationship to them. You might have direct suppliers who are not very willing to share information with you. And it might also be very difficult to have an updated network of all your supply chains and networks at hand, because companies are trading resources, services, and products at markets. So who buys what from whom when is something that is constantly changing, and mapping this and having this updated in order to know, oh, company, my tier 3 supplier, company A, has this problem, is something that might not be feasible in many contexts. And it might not always be necessary, because if you know, for example, you're buying a high risk resource or product from a high risk in a high risk country, you know that your direct supplier is sourcing it from there. You don't know from whom exactly he's sourcing that, but you already know enough for the purposes of your risk analysis, and you might then be able to design measures that help you address this without having actually to have identifiable information, to have full transparency of the supply chain. So this talk around transparency of the supply chain is not always very helpful, because it might be completely unrealistic to have this like perfect 100% accurate and current map of who buys what from whom, when, and where. So there's some measures that you can design, for example, by empowering your supplier to be addressing things. Maybe you have a supplier who's willing to share information with you and say, okay, I have my direct supplier, he has these and these problems, I can't address them myself, let's work together on this. But in many cases, it might be possible that you have to address your direct supplier and empower them in addressing problems. And also, if we look at own contributions, it might also be that addressing own contributions towards the direct supplier might lead to benefits in the deeper supply chain. That's something that we'll look at as well, procurement practices, and addressing these as using these as tools for preventive or remedial measures, addressing own contributions. So next, I want to talk about audits. And audits, a very important tool in business practice, in due diligence processes, risk management processes, and audits serve a triple role basically in the context of the Supply Chain Act. You see it highlighted on the right side of the slide, and also addressed on the slide itself. So audits are a very important tool to identify risks and violations. They're important for the risk analysis. They're also important for preventive and remedial measures, because they serve as a tool to control whether other measures have been successful. And they're also very important for effectiveness assessment. The Due Diligence Act does not follow a safe harbor approach. This means that by relying on audits alone, companies cannot fulfill their own due diligence obligations. Yet at the same time, we know that for many measures under the Act, companies need to take recourse to third parties, because they might not have the relevant expertise internally in order to be able to assess the situation. Companies cannot be expected to have language skills, expertise in relation to region and culture, in relation to, for example, all the countries to which they're connected by means of their supply chains. So that's something where they often rely on audits, which is per se not a problem. But if we look at the quality of audits, and I think this is one of the reasons why the Supply Chain Act doesn't follow a safe harbor approach, and the CS3D will also not follow a safe harbor approach, the quality of audits in the past has been often very problematic. There has been many cases where there were not enough efforts in relation to corruption prevention. We must also note that announced audits are not very helpful, because oftentimes sites are cleared up, documents are being prepared that serve the purpose for showing a scenario that's very different from the normal situation at that company. So that's something, if you want to audit a company, if you either do it yourself or you have an external expert, might want to look at measures of corruption prevention, and look at how can the audit be as effective as possible to serve the purpose of actually identifying the situation on the ground, instead of just having a certification that says things are fine. Because the law, since law requires effectiveness, we've looked at effectiveness and appropriateness, companies really need to know the situation on the ground, and not anymore just have a certification about how things are fine. So next, I would like to look at contract design. So what do the criteria of effectiveness and appropriateness mean in relation to designing contracts that serve the purpose of prevention or remediation? We've seen on the slide in relation to preventive measures that the law focuses a lot on the contractual relationship between direct and supplier and the company itself. And contractual assurances and contracts in general can be a really helpful and important tool, but there's some context in which there's some design elements that should be implemented in these contracts in order to make them an effective tool to manage human rights and environmental risks. And the criteria of appropriateness and effectiveness limit what companies are allowed to do in relation to contracts and contractual assurances. You see it on the slide. A mere transfer of obligations does not meet the requirements of effectiveness and appropriateness. Obviously, if a supplier in a high-risk context signs a code of conduct where they say they take care of everything, they meet all of these standards, they manage them in their own operations and in the supply chain, and everything is great. This is merely unrealistic and doesn't meet the threshold of effectiveness. It might also be inappropriate, because we've looked at the criteria of appropriateness. It might demand action from someone who's not able to do that. We have seen the criteria nature and extent of a company's activities. They might have to invest a little bit more, but also own contributions. Just transferring down obligations does not usually address own contributions. And so what we need instead, code of conduct contracts should implement concepts of shared responsibility, of collaboration. And this means that capacity and legitimate interests of suppliers need to be considered. So a supplier who's already not able to meet standards, they will not be more able to do so just by signing a code of conduct or a contract. Code of conducts and contracts obviously are still important, because they serve as an important operational tool. They are an important communicative tool to share the expectation one has in relation to the supplier. But they need to be combined with, or they should include the contract and code of conduct themselves, a support offer from the obliged company. And also suppliers shouldn't be expected to do things that counteract their own legitimate interests, like, for example, sharing sensitive information, especially in relation to the deeper supply chain, if they don't want to make identifiable specific actors for fear, for example, of being excluded from the supply chain. That's something that we discussed very intensively in a different webinar in this series in relation to the knock-on effects of the Supply Chain Act. Then we probably need, in most cases, these contractual assurances need to be combined with other tools, especially with control mechanisms, or for example, also with trainings, with financial support. It might also be an idea to include own obligations for the buying company in relation to procurement practices, what we'll look at in a little bit. And what's important to note also is the enabling before withdrawal, what I mentioned already, the prioritization of prevention and remediation over the termination of a business relationship. And here in this context, it's really important to note the negative incentives that bad contract design, bad design of code of conducts can set. if we, for example, have a code of conduct that shifts all the responsibility, shifts all the risk to the supplier, where they say, everything is fine, I do everything, I guarantee this and that. And then the code of conduct or contract includes a clause that reserves the right of the buyer to terminate the business relationship if they find any problems. So if any of these things that the supplier was obliged to guarantee isn't met, this creates a situation in which the supplier will be in breach of contract on day one at the moment after signing, basically, and a situation in which they will have there will be negative consequences related to this breach of contract that they might want to try to avoid. So first of all, potentially losing an important customer is something that they want to avoid, but also there might be other disadvantages connected to that, for example, contractual damages. And so we will create a situation in which the supplier will do a lot to prevent the buyer from finding out what the situation is at the facility. And this then links back to this bad practice that we've observed for decades in relation to audits, where audits more serve the purpose of certifying that things are fine instead of showing what the situation is. The practice around audits and also questionnaires, suppliers truthfully answering to this, will only be created when contract design really changes and implements these principles. Otherwise, a poor contract design is really the best way into sabotaging all efforts of due diligence. So I'm a little bit over time, so I want to also share really quickly a couple of thoughts in relation to procurement practices as preventive measures. So procurement practices play a fundamental role in the context of the Supply Chain Act. They're mentioned as one of several possible preventive measures. They're also strongly emphasized in the explanatory memorandum of the German government, and they're actually a tool that always is available to all companies. So we've talked about the ability to influence. Oftentimes it's very difficult to influence actors outside of your own company because they might not want to do the things that you want to do, but your own activities, your own actions is something that every company, to a certain degree at least, because pricing obviously there's other factors involved, but to a certain degree companies can impact. And we've looked at the criteria of appropriateness. I've mentioned own contributions need to be ended or balanced out. So if the price doesn't allow for wages to be paid in a sufficient amount, the supplier will not be more able to pay wages after signing a code of conduct in which he says he does so if the price doesn't change. So this usually in many of these discussions is the elephant in the room. Companies often think that they can continue with business as usual without actually addressing how they contribute to negative impacts, and on top of their business as usual have a nice managerial process on top of it. This actually doesn't work because in some contexts the law really requires companies to address at the core how they behave in relation to certain suppliers and supply chains. So when prices must include direct and indirect labor costs, including costs for sustainability and living wages and income. I know this is very difficult to do because rarely there's open book calculations, and companies also want to make sure that they can rely on the price that was offered to them. But we need to consider that in some markets the situation is very competitive. And other elements to consider is lead times, short-term changes, and then long-term contractual terms. Only long-term contractual relationships actually allow for a meaningful collaboration between suppliers and buyers. We know from experiences from the textile industry that contractual terms of at least 5 years lead to these improvements, lead to a situation of stability that is sufficient for the supplier to be willing and able to invest into more costly measures to improve operational health and safety, for example, or to provide for better wages. The higher wage is something that he might continue to have to pay even when the buyer has found themselves a different supplier. Yes, so much in order to not stretch time even more in relation to procurement practices. And I'm very happy to be answering questions now.
Thank you so much, Michaela. As usual, wealth of knowledge and really much appreciated your intervention. Here we have a bunch of questions already. So just to kick things off, the very first one is about how is remediation understood? Is it only about terminating the impact? I think you addressed that in the beginning of your presentation. So maybe we can go back to the slide, but yeah.
So this is actually something that's disputed under the Supply Chain Act. The way I understand it, so it means remediation in the context of the Act is generally understood by the government as not requiring actual remedy, meaning that there's damages to be paid, but there's some contexts in which remediation requires paying money to victims as compensation, for example, in order to compensate them for lost wages after being injured, for example, or being ill. And it might also be necessary to do more than just ending your activity that has caused the violation. For example, if repairs need to be made, if the environment needs to be cleaned up. For example, just ending emitting toxins into the environment doesn't really fix the situation of the toxins that are there already, and it might also be possible to have to compensate victims, for example, for their medical expenses. But in addition to that, it's generally not understood to require further payments than that.
Thanks for the clarification. Next question relates to purchasing practices. In relation to direct and indirect suppliers, does a company within scope have to cease own actions that contribute to violations? So regarding purchasing practices, for example.
Yes, so companies would be well advised in the context of their risk analysis to also analyze their own purchasing practices and then use this as a starting point for adapting these purchasing practices. I know this is something that's not easily done, and it might not always be feasible to do this in relation to all supply chains, but the criteria of appropriateness allow companies to prioritize, and so companies can, for example, take a risk-based approach and start addressing the supply chains that are where the most severe violations are with the highest chance of occurrence. And this is something that is understood in the context of the Supply Chain Act, although it doesn't explicitly mention that procurement practices should be analyzed in the context of the risk analysis. This is a little bit different in the relation to the CS3D and most pronounced in the Parliament's position, where the provision on risk analysis actually does specifically include that purchasing practices should be analyzed and also adapted. Maybe so far.
Yeah. Thank you for the clarification. There's another question that relates to the effectiveness criteria that you mentioned. So the question is, what is end? We can prevent and we can minimize it, but how to end it? If you can elaborate a bit on that.
Yeah, I mean, end means basically that the violation stops. So the wage is paid now in a normal amount, and that the missing wage was paid as well, that the fire rules, fire training is being done, that the machinery is safe, that work time rules are being observed. So it's basically that the violation stops, but as I explained, it might also mean a little bit more, because after emitting toxins into the environment needs to be cleaned, or somebody who was injured after an accident, even though the facility is now safe, they still might need to see a doctor to get better, or they might need to be compensated for their lost wages because they weren't able to work after an accident, for example.
Yeah. Next question relates to identifying suppliers. So do you have a good advice for how to identify indirect downstream suppliers, or is there a more definite definition of who that is?
Yeah, I think it's really important to move away from this idea of full transparency, because I just think it's not realistic and would be very resource intensive to have this like perfect mapping that is updated constantly, because who buys what from whom changes all the time. And in many cases, suppliers will not be willing to share this information because it's a trade secret, actually, who are your business partners. So you can't be forced to share this, and they might not want to share this out of legitimate fear from being excluded out of the supply chain. And this creates a really difficult situation when you start pushing your direct suppliers to share this information. And in many cases, it's not necessary. For the purposes of risk analysis, if you know it's you're buying cocoa from Ivory Coast, you don't need to know if it's farm A, B, C, or D to be able to know that there's a very high risk for certain rights violations. And you can then design measures that address the problem, for example, in the region, instead of having to say, is it company A, B, or C that employs children? I need to go there specifically. And oftentimes, if you look at the criteria of appropriateness, if an actor is very far removed from you, and they also have lots of other buying companies at the far end of these supply chains leading out of there, you alone are not required, one company alone is not required to fix this all by themselves, but instead it makes sense to collaborate with other actors, also because it cannot be reasonably expected of them to be, fixing all of these serious rights violations all over the world. So it also really depends on how much do you have contributed, but what are also the other contributions of other actors. And also your influence might not be far-reaching enough to, even if you identified, this is this company, and then you go there and it's like, okay, so some German company they have never heard of says like, you need to, do these things now. And they're like, okay, I don't know. Yeah. So when it makes a lot more sense to try to engage with other actors together, with other companies and initiatives, for example, if this was a problem that you've identified that has maybe a bit of a regional or industry-specific scope, that you can then act together, maybe in collaboration with civil society organizations, and combined with doing the things that you can do, which is adjust your procurement practices in a way that reduce contributions to these rights violations, which oftentimes has a lot to do with pricing. But pricing alone obviously doesn't always fix the thing. So you can, for example, connect pricing clauses in contracts with obligations of suppliers to show that they use the additional funds for a specific purpose instead of just keeping it to themselves. So this is often an argument we hear from companies that say, if I pay a higher price, how do I know that they use this to pay better wages or to make improvement in operational safety and health? There's some things you can do.
Yeah. Next question relates to audits. So you already pointed it out. We know that audits are not sufficient if company has embedded operation systems for identifying, preventing, remediating, and reporting. Is a lack of audits considered bad practice?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the criteria of the appropriate manner, already for the risk analysis, this means that depending on how risk-prone a certain supplier or supply chain is, you need to use different tools for risk analysis of different intensities. So it might not be sufficient to just send a self-assessment questionnaire, but instead an on-site visit or an audit might be necessary in order to meet the criteria of appropriateness. But it is really important, but this is true for all measures in relation to the Supply Chain Act. They have to be fit for purpose. An audit is not fit for purpose if an auditor asks the head of the company open question like, do you have child labor? Do you have forced labor? I mean, this is not very helpful because they just say no, or yes. Same is true for a self-assessment questionnaire. We need to consider, I've mentioned this before, that announced audits are not very helpful in identifying risks and violations. Obviously, it might be difficult if there's a very intensive audit for a supplier to be ending his activities for the site to be audited, and then they struggle meeting maybe a deadline for a different buying company. So it's possible, for example, to split audits and have some part of the audit done in an announced way and then come around unannounced to try to identify other rights violations. There's lots of reporting in relation to documents being forged for the purpose of audits. So pay slips, for example, time slips being created just for the purpose of showing auditors that things are fine. Many audits will not include speaking to workers in an environment that actually allows them to speak truthfully about their experiences, but instead they will do this on factory premises. These workers will be selected by the head of the company. So this is obviously not very helpful. But I think we need to combine better quality audits with corruption prevention mechanisms in context of where corruption is high, and also better code of conducts and contracts, because I think when we inform suppliers that we don't want to hear anymore that everything is okay to move on with things, but actually really need to know how things are, because we need this to derive measures from this information, then they might want to change practice. But I think they will only be enabled to do so if we also work with more long-term contracts, because if it's a single purchase at a specific supplier, or like a short-term contract maybe of a year, they will think, okay, now I've informed them how difficult the situation actually is and how much money I would need to be providing these goods or services. They might choose someone else now because it's a little bit too much for them. So we need to combine this and start engaging with on a more long-term basis.
Yeah. We're kind of running out of time in terms of the Q&A. There's still a bunch of questions. I'll still pick a couple of them, and Michaela would ask you to try to respond short and concise so we can fit as many in as possible.
Okay.
Next one relates to what type of audits will be acceptable for German suppliers.
This is a good question. I mean, it really depends on what kind of rights violation you try to identify, whether it's a social audit or a more technical audit. And we yet need to learn more from BAFA how they understand this. But I mean, generally we have the criteria effectiveness and appropriateness, which means an audit must be conducted in a way that it reveals the situation on the site, provides good quality information.
And who's doing the audits? There was on slide 17, mention audits here.
Yeah, I mean, but generally the understanding under the Supply Chain Act, this is also the understanding of the competent authority, the BAFA, is that measures that serve the purpose of fulfilling a legal obligation of an obliged company should be borne by them. So the cost for measures should be borne by them. I know in practice it's often different, that, for example, a supplier gets a certain type of certification, covers the costs for that. But this is not problematic if he then, for example, changes pricing, and all companies that buy from the supplier then pay maybe a little bit of a different price, and the costs for certification and including the audit is then compensated. But generally the idea is that this burden of these types of measures should not be shifted to suppliers.
And there's a question that I can respond to, if there are any recommendations, or if you can direct companies to relevant materials or courses related to guidance or resources for suppliers along the supply chain. We of course have our amfori Academy, and in that sense, it's all the trainings on social and environmental performance are free of charge for the suppliers of our members.
Maybe
you have other.
Just to add, there's a guidance that BAFA and Helpdesk published together a couple of months ago on collaboration in the supply chain, that deals not only with the knock-on effects, but actually highlights how both obliged companies and their suppliers can work together with, and shows a couple of ideas on, like, what do I do if I don't want to share specific information, or if they want to make me cover for the cost, and who should pay for what, how much, how is cost sharing, how should it be done under the Supply Chain Act? That might be very helpful.
Yeah. And then there's a question on whether the help desk will also be accessible to suppliers in key sourcing countries of German companies, so including Global South.
I mean, generally, companies can also turn towards us, but obviously, German help desk cannot advise all companies around the globe. I don't think this is realistic. And then there's other support offers as well. So the GIZ Initiative for Global Solidarity has launched responsible business hubs in several sourcing countries. I'm not sure if I can mention all of them, as Vietnam, Serbia, Tunisia, Mexico, Cambodia, and Bangladesh, if I'm not mistaken. So if you're situated in any of these countries, getting in touch with the responsible business hub help desks of the GIZ might be interesting for you. And then there's other support offers as well, like other associations like amfori and others.
Yes, indeed. Okay, I would propose that we close the Q&A here. We can, maybe, Michaela, you can try to respond to some of them in writing as we go through the other presentations. And then at the end, we have another Q&A where we'll hopefully be able to also pick up some of them, should there not be direct questions to the speakers that are to come now. But for the sake of time, I propose that we move on. Thank you so much, Michaela, as always, very, very insightful, and thanks so much for answering all these questions. And I will now very, very briefly give you an overview of amfori's tools supporting preventative and remedial action. Of course, this is tools that are available to the amfori members only. So first of all, Michaela mentioned, audits play an important role. Of course, they need to be combined with other measures, but companies can cascade the amfori BSCI and BPI code of conduct, which they sign as members of amfori, through contractual assurances to their suppliers. Also, of course, the role of responsible purchasing practices is crucial in this regard. We have published a guidance on the topic and also worked together with the German PST and other MSIs such as Fairware and ETI on a common framework on responsible purchasing practices, which is publicly available. You can look at that and use that as a bit of a reference to understand where you stand in this regard. It, of course, refers to key topics such as pricing, lead times, all the things that Michaela mentioned also earlier, avoiding short-term changes and contractual, making sure the contractual terms are fair and so on. Then also, of course, we have the Academy. I already mentioned that. So it's free of charge for our members and their business partners, so the suppliers. This year we've trained more than 8,000 people. So that's, CSR managers, compliance managers, and so on in the global value chains of our members. And there's learning journeys on really various topics that relate to our key products and audits. So amfori BSCI performance areas and amfori BPI performance areas. Then when it comes to remediation, it's also really about engaging with the business partners through continuous improvement measures and monitoring their progress. We have around 35,000 measures that have been completed in our system. So that's basically responses to findings in the audit. So that's of course a good practice to make sure that when there's an audit report and there are findings to follow through with the improvement process through specific measures, whether they're trainings or policies or other changes that are required to improve the situation. Then we also facilitate cooperation in remediation through the Zero Tolerance Protocol and of course, our supply chain agreements mechanism Speak for Change, which is available in Vietnam, Turkey, Bangladesh, and soon also India. Still this year, it will be launched, and you can look at all the cases that have come in that we're investigating or remediating on our public website. So that's, in a nutshell, the key tools that amfori offers to support its members through or with prevention and remediation. And then I'll hand over to Isabel to give a similar presentation related to the German PST's offering. So Isabel, please, floor's yours.
Yes, thank you very much, and also a warm welcome to everyone. Maybe please allow me just to mention some also introductory words concerning the Partnership for Sustainable Textiles. For those of you who don't know it, we are a multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together members from civil society, the private sector, as well as the German government. And our work mainly focuses on 3 areas, so to say. So one element is the implementation of due diligence, then supply chain transparency, and then we also put a strong focus on developing joint projects in production countries. And how does our work relate to preventative and remedial actions? So first of all, what I want to mention is I just mentioned before that we put a strong focus on the implementation of due diligence. So in our own reporting process that PST members go through, one key part is that based on a risk analysis, they develop preventative actions, or also remedial actions if appropriate. Then also, and I think this is very similar to what Franz just mentioned before, we do quite a bit with regards to capacity building. So there are a number of trainings, guidelines, and peer learnings. Also want to mention our work on purchasing practices, but also with regards to other topics, for example, climate action, wastewater management, or chemical management. And then also, I mentioned before that we put a focus on developing these joint projects that are taking place in production countries, and where a number of members from different stakeholder groups come together. And also one key of these projects is also, ideally to serve as preventative measures. Here I can point out the learning implementation community, but also a project we do on supplier decarbonization, or advancing work-alike agreements in gender justice. And if you have, because we're very limited in time today, but if you have any questions on any of those projects, please feel also free to reach out to me afterwards. And then talking about remedial actions, I mentioned before our own internal reporting process, but then also when it comes to grievance mechanisms, I've mentioned that before, that we do not have our own grievance mechanisms, but that we rather decided to work with other organizations such as amfori, such as also Fairware or FLA, just to mention a few. And that we also opened the Fairware mechanism to some of our members. So I think this is briefly in a nutshell what we do within the partnership. And again, if there are any questions, please reach out to me. But what we do now is we have two guests today that want to share a bit from a practical point of view what they do with regards to preventative actions and also remedial actions. So I'm happy to give the floor to Regina Kalfels first, and then afterwards to Juan Jose Gomez. Maybe just for you as the audience, you will hear both presentations first, and then we have another Q&A afterwards where you can ask questions directed at the two, or if we have more time, we can also pick up some of the questions that were asked with regards to Michaela's presentation. So Regina, I'm happy to hand over to you. Maybe just again, Francis mentioned at the beginning, Regina Kalfels works for Deltex, which is both a member to the partnership, but also to amfori, and is the team lead sustainability, and will share a bit more about their a bit practical insights on preventative actions taken at Deltex. Regina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Isabel, for the kind introduction. Yeah, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we are doing at Deltex and how our business model works. So Deltex is actually a quite small company. We are only 50 people here in Hamburg, but we pay a lot of attention to supply chain transparency. And in a minute, I will tell you why we put this focus. So we are commissioned by retail companies to produce mostly textiles. So we do like full fashion collections, but also we need to pitch for individual orders. And we mainly serve the discount markets. And as you can see from this slide, we are already part of a lot of initiatives. And we started our corporate responsibility journey approximately 10 years back. So our main production countries are Bangladesh and China. And in the meantime, we also entered Pakistan. Yeah, we are mostly doing textiles, also shoes, but also some home textiles recently. Yeah, and since we are supplying the discount market, the name of our company is always printed on the product. So this is also putting us in the position of being, accountable for certain risks, though we do not fall under the Supply Chain Act. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, I would like to tell a little bit about our position within the value chain, because I think this is quite common for many companies operating in Europe or in the global north. So we are like an agency. We are in the middle of the supply chain, actually. So we receive requirements from our customers and also requirements regarding the product. And we need to forward all this information to the factories. And we do not have fixed contractual obligations with our factories, but we try to have a very, very focus on having supply chain transparency and also knowing all of our tiers way up to raw material supplies. And at the same time, we are also obliged to give all the information from the supply chain back to our customers. So what we basically do here in Germany and also with our offices in Bangladesh and in China, we handle a lot of data and information regarding the value chain, and we are also asked a lot of questions, and we need to be ready to give answers at all the time. And at the same time, of course, we only get paid for the product if the product is shipped. So the whole production risk lies on us. And for us, this is vital to know our supply chain, because otherwise we cannot survive. Next slide, please. So what we did to, coming from a risk analysis to apply preventive measures. So first of all, as I already said, we do know our supply chain. So at least to up to 99%. I think this is also special because we're working in a textile environment, and also systems which have developed within the textile supply chain regarding transparency and the auditing practices. They are quite elaborated compared to other industries. So this is giving us a huge push. But nevertheless, since we are working in operating in high-risk countries, still we are very prone to be asked questions, widespread questions regarding what we are doing exactly at the production areas, and also we are prone to be asked questions by communities, by customers, and also of course from all of our supply chain partners. But at the same time, we do not have a lot of influence on the products we produce. So for example, we cannot decide which raw material standard we would like to apply to the product, because we are operating in a very, very price-sensitive, price-driven environment. And due to this, our operative range where we can apply preventive measures is very, very limited. So what we did when we applied for the certification for the green button, this year, I think we took the audit for the 5th time. We did within our risk analysis kind of categorization. So the ones who have already gone through the audit know the process. Here on my slide, you can see a screenshot from the table of the risk analysis we took. These are the preventive measures we identified. So this is only a snapshot. I only choose six preventive measures, or measures we need to take preventives on. And the first one is we would like to develop preventive measures on emissions. So this is applying at our wet production facilities mostly. So we identified that we have some data gaps in our production facilities. And also we would like to reduce the emissions and also reduce the resources we need to get the product produced. And the second preventive measures we took is to take more care of our Pakistan activities. So Deltex was entering the Pakistani market only 1.5 years ago, and my team from Bangladesh took over the auditing process. But still, we were very unsure about the situation on the ground because we were not able to be there all the time and accompany the whole production process. And of course, we also had, we were afraid that there were some severe health and safety risks in Pakistan, also regarding the structural safety of the buildings. And yeah, we decided that we definitely need to take some measures on Pakistan. And on the next slide, you can see what we were then initiating. So for the T2 emissions, our goals were set for that we would like to tackle the data gap we have at our Tier 2 wet production facilities. And we wanted to get this. So in the past, we were performing our own chemical management audits at the factories, but we were looking for a more broader approach to not put too much pressure on the factories at the same time. So we are looking for a cooperation. And what we wanted to prevent by this is unnecessary resource consumption in terms of chemicals, in terms of water, but also in terms of energy. And of course, also reducing the risk for the local communities or also for the employees, handling the chemicals, handling wastewater and emissions. And then we started in 2020 already a cooperation with Go Blue and Beehive for having digital chemical inventories. We trained the factories, and since July 2023, we are also engaging in the supplier decarbonization project Isabel was mentioning before. Yes, and these are the preventive measures for the T2 emissions we gained from our risk analysis. And for Pakistan, we wanted to have, our main goal was to have more safe factories and also apply our human rights due diligence and our CR monitoring activities. We wanted to gain more supply chain transparency because if we have a product produced somewhere where we don't know the factory, this is a big risk for us, also in terms of product risks and also in terms of not having our customer accept the product in the end. And we decided to establish a CR monitoring system on the ground. And what we wanted to prevent by this is we don't want to see accidents happen at the factories involving people and work rights holders. We want to prevent that we have these supply chain risks, unsafe production conditions, and also the risk of not getting our products out of the factory. And so we decided to hire our own CR employee in Pakistan and also to sign the International Pakistan Accord. And what my team in Bangladesh is currently doing, they are training our new employee in Pakistan on our requirements. And they also can learn from each other regarding the implementation of the Pakistan Accord. Yeah, and that's basically it in a nutshell.
Thank you very much. I think if there are questions, we come back to you, Regina. But now, also looking at the time, I would hand over to Juan, and also please keep your presentation to the 10 minutes so that we can have questions at the end. Thank you so much. And Juan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you very much to amfori to inviting us, El Corte Inglés, to this very interesting session. For those who do not know what is El Corte Inglés, we are a department store based in Spain and Portugal, and we are selling all kinds of stuff from fashion, homeware, electrical appliances, electronics, food, and so on, and a lot of services. That means that our suppliers, we are working with around 20,000 different suppliers, and out of them, with 2,500 suppliers for our own brands, working in around 3,000 different factories. So since I know that we are a little bit short of time, I will focus in the slide that you are seeing. I will skip the introduction, and I will focus on two cases. What you see, the multi-sectoral framework agreement with trade unions as a best practice in terms of prevention, and then in the Speak for Change supply chain mechanism of amfori, where I will highlight a case that was a best practice according to us. So let us go directly to the framework agreement. Excuse me that I'm seeing my notes. So since we endeavor to improve on a continuous basis our ESG prevention system, we also rely on any information that could be uncovered by our different stakeholders, NGOs, and especially global and local unions. That is the purpose of the last prevention tool that I want to highlight, the framework agreement with unions. In July 2021, ECI, El Corte Inglés, signed, together with the two Spanish national unions, a framework agreement for union participation in the El Corte Inglés value chain. This agreement was the result of ECI having collaborated for more than 10 years with organized unionism, both national and international, for the application of ESG commitments in our supply chain. In this sense, the most notable example was the 2013 Bangladesh Accord. What are the main characteristics of this agreement? It is transversal, EU and third countries, of course, and multi-sectoral, fashion, home, leisure, and food. In terms of supply markets, we buy from EU countries, Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, of course, but then also Morocco, Turkey, Bangladesh, Pakistan, India, Southeast countries, China, and so on. The working method of the framework agreement consists of periodically holding work meetings where the most notable impacts and risks in ESG at that moment are shared transparently, but on a confidential basis. And as a consequence of this analysis, we organize common visits to factories in different countries or sectors. For instance, in this year, work visits in the Spanish fruit and vegetable and meat sector have begun to be addressed in Spain, where field work has been extended to tier 1, tier 2, and even primary production. And as a last example, next month in November, we will trip with together with the two unions to China and visit there several factories in China. Now, that was a little bit the highlight that I wanted to put in terms of prevention. And now let us go to the part of remediation. And there I want to speak about the grievance mechanism. We use in the Corte Inglés the Accord, the International Accord grievance mechanism. We use our own one that we have, and increasingly we are using amfori's Speak for Change grievance mechanism. First in Vietnam, then in Turkey, and in the midterm, it will be also in Bangladesh and India. And I would like to highlight one case of Vietnam. The case was the following. There were 2 complaints were received from several complainants each. One of them related to overtime and the other to forced labor. The lead respondent member, that means the brand who had to manage this complaint, was ourselves, ECI, and there was a second amfori member involved. Always under the coordination of the amfori Speak for Change office and in common agreement with the other retailer, an investigation handler was chosen out of those pre-selected and trained by Speak for Change, who traveled to the factory to carry out the budgeted field study. The result of the investigation report quickly brought to light not only that the complaints were founded, but that both were due to systemic problems in the factory that had not been detected previously in the audits and that transcended the scope of the individual complaints. So, in common agreement with the other brand to use the leverage effect, accordingly, as the lead respondent member, sent one of my colleagues, an ESG manager from Madrid, to the factory, and another local ESG manager from our Vietnam office. And there they met with the factory management, making them see the absolute severity of both cases. Precisely because of this direct intervention by us, and for reasons of efficiency, it was agreed with the other retailer and with Speak for Change office that exceptionally ECI would be the remediation handler, and that on principle and theoretically had to be another third party. ECI prepared a remediation plan that was transmitted to the factory. The factory agreed with it, and in accordance with the agreed deadlines, ECI ESG manager from Vietnam office visited the factory on a second occasion to evaluate compliance with the plan. The result was positive, but nevertheless, and also and always in agreement with the other retailer, it was proposed to the factory that an unannounced audit would be carried out to verify the general situation of the factory. Of course, it was a full audit, but in particular, the both negative impacts. We briefed to the audit company that all the details of the investigation and remediation phases so that it would focus on both aspects, and a full amfori audit was carried out, which was positive, thus closing the remediation phases definitively. And there was a good question before of what is the end of remediation. Definitively, but we have from now on still to continue monitoring the factory because of we are always trying to improve the situation. From this case, the following conclusions of good practices can be drawn according to us. The involvement, first, the involvement of factory ownership management for the effectiveness of the Speak for Change channel of the factory is essential. The intensity of the onboarding program in the factory is essential also. Training in vernacular language for both management and workers. Second point. Third point, the speed with which the investigation and remediation phases of the claim are managed and completed is also essential, although this objective cannot be at odds with the efficiency and effectiveness of the remediation. Fourth, the quality of the investigation report is essential as well as its rigorous accurateness regarding the specific claims. If, and that was the case of this case, if the findings exceed the claims, the additional matter must be brought to the attention of the brands for their direct intervention, apart from the investigation report that is shared with the complainants and factory management. Also very important in both phases, if the claim affects more than one member of amfori, the leverage effect of joining efforts, that is crucial, leverage. And last but not least, the coordination role of amfori Speak for Change team is also crucial, especially if there is more than one brand involved, a little bit under the same scheme than when a zero tolerance case is triggered in amfori and various brands are engaged. So I'm finishing. At the next meeting of the framework agreement, of course, we will report this case with the appropriate confidentiality filters, of course, to the unions for a matter of transparency and of monitoring continuous improvement. And this last element leads me to the last point, which is the most important from my point of view, that of cooperation in accordance with the SDG 70 partnership for the goals. When I mean cooperation, I'm thinking of cooperation with unions and other reference stakeholders. I am also speaking of cooperation of Speak for Change with other grievance mechanisms such as the Accord One, ETI, Fairware. And also in the field of ESG audits, from a Corte Inglés point of view, it is also a very important thing of cooperating amfori with other initiatives such as SA 1000 or SAC. So, and with this, I finish my presentation. I hope it has been of some use to you, and I thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thanks to both of you for sharing your insights on how to, practically go about developing preventative but also remedial measures and actions. If there are no further questions or questions directed at Regina or Juan, Michaela, I would propose that we maybe come back to some of the questions that were asked earlier, knowing that you have been also, I think, quite busy answering a lot of those already in the chat. But maybe we can take a couple minutes, 2 or 3, to look at those, and then we close today's webinar. Michaela, maybe, I don't know, have you read the remaining questions, and there are some that you find particularly interesting yourself? Otherwise, I would maybe just pick some from the audience. And Juan, I also see there's another question for you. So maybe I address this first. I just saw that, and we start with that. So Juan, can you please share some details on the remediation plan adopted to remediate the 2 claims related to forced labor and overtime? How did you address the pricing issue, the elephant in the room, as it was described?
Well, to give you more details, first of all, the report in the case is officially published by amfori. To go into deeper details, since it is another brand involved and it is a factory where we are working, I would not like to go into deeper details in terms of what were the findings and how we addressed the improvements. But generally speaking, I want to highlight that for me, it is very important that when you sit down with the management of a factory, you can say that this is an intention not only of your company, but also of the other companies that are involved and are producing. So the leverage effect for me is very important, so that the solutions are smooth and the possible solutions are found. And in terms of pricing, yes, of course, that is the elephant. We are doing continuous improvements, continuous efforts with our buying teams. We are making trainings with them into responsible buying. It is very important that it must come from top. The senior management of a Corte Inglés has to say, I am for responsible buying, and then it is something of training the central buyers and the offices, so that they try to be very, very rigorous with lead times, with all the authorizations of samples, with never trying to squeeze prices under cost limits and so on. And we do periodically trainings with our central banks. For example, this year we are training around 500 central buyers in responsible buying that we are doing together with our training department. We are doing 1 hour sessions to the buyers, interactive, so that not only the theory is explained, but we also hear the feedbacks from the buyers.
Thank you. Regina, then there's also one question for you. What projects Deltex is undertaking to promote sustainability among its supply chain? Do you have anything to add to what you already said in your presentation?
So currently we are part of the Textile Partnership in 2 projects. This is one is the grievance mechanism project and also the supply decarbonization project. But at the same time, as we have CR teams in all our production countries, we definitely sit down with all our supply chain partners. We talk to them. We try to build up long-lasting relationships. We try to give them some securities that we will again place order, and we also apply our auditing standards at least 2 times a year. And apart from that, there are also third-party audits conducted, customer audits. So and apart from that, we also have some policies like our sustainability policy, which is kind of a training material and a guideline how to enhance due diligence in the supply chains. And we also accompany this with trainings at production facilities. You can also get some information from our website. We're currently updating the website. But in a few weeks, I guess there will also be some information about the projects, external projects we are doing with other business partners on this.
Thank you. And Michaela, since I invited you back to the stage, maybe one final question for you. It is, who decides and based on what is a high-risk product related to the action needs to be taken in the supply chain?
So a product or a context is more high risk, the less likely the occurrence and the more severe occurrence of a violation would be. And ultimately, in the end, it would be up to courts to decide. But in this situation, as of now, this is something that would be decided by BAFA when they're assessing a company, for example, and they are doing this based on a risk database that they're still in the context of creating at the moment. And this risk database, according to my understanding, will include also information that that is publicly available. And these are sources that companies will oftentimes use themselves in order to identify whether or not something is high risk or less risk. So reports from NGOs, reports from government services, media reports, for example. And there's lots of information out there in relation to the situation in specific countries, regions, or industries. And often I believe that BAFA will also include other findings that they gain from their assessment activities, investigation that they conduct in relation to individual companies into this risk database.
Thank you very much. And knowing that we're running out of time, moving to the closing of today's session, I want to thank amfori Francis, Michaela from the help desk again for your insights, and then also again Regina and Juan for providing us with your insights from a very practical perspective. Also, please make sure to check out our previous webinars and the recordings if you have any questions related to risk analysis, but also to grievance mechanisms. So we have done quite a bit of work in the past, and if you have questions on those topics, make sure to look at those. And then there will also be another webinar taking place in January on purchasing practices. I'm not sure whether we communicate the date already, but if so, Francis, please maybe post it in the chat. So we're happy to see you there. Francis, I'm handing over to you for the really final words for today's session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Thank you, Michaela. Thank you, Juanjo, and also, of course, Regina. Thank you all for participating. And just a final note related to also our upcoming conference in Berlin. It's on the 6th and 7th of November. Just to say that you can still register. However, on-site participation is not possible anymore. But you can follow the live stream, so it's still worth registering, even if you're just interested in specific sessions. Also, for the date of the next webinar on responsible purchasing practices, indeed we can communicate that already, but I have to say I don't know from the top of my head what it is. I believe it was towards the end of January, but we will share that in the follow-up email. And you can, of course, also find this on our registration page, on the events page, and also on the PST's page and the German help desk. We'll also communicate about it. So thank you all very, very much for joining. Really appreciated the session, and we'll share with you the slides and recording, and hope you enjoyed it, and looking forward to see you all in the next one in January. Thank you so much.